Hello, this is Sue Lloyd, Vice Chair of the ISSB, and I'm here with our Chair, Emmanuel Faber. We're recording this podcast today just after our March board week here in Montreal. And I guess the big headline from us this month is that we're back in consultation mode. So we're asking for feedback on proposals to update 3 further SASB standards: agricultural products, meat, poultry and dairy, and electric utilities and power generators. So Emmanuel, perhaps you could start by talking to us about those proposals.
Thank you, Sue. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dog and Pony Show of the ISSB, and I'm sure you appreciate starting with the voice of our vice chair. So let me add my own here to say that indeed, we're back in consultation mode with the SASB standards again. Investors have consistently told us they value industry-specific information, and that's why the ISSB standards require it and why we are going through a process of enhancing the SASB standards. These proposals are consistent with the approach that we took in the earlier consultation on the first 9 of the 12 SASB standards that we are prioritizing on our 2024-26 agenda for enhancement. I think there would be 4 key things that I could highlight about those proposals. The first is that they align language and concept in the SASB standards with ISSB standards. The second, that they improve international applicability and decision usefulness of the standards. Third, they support interoperability with other standards and frameworks while staying focused on the information needs of investors. And fourth and finally, they include consequential amendments, as did the prior 9 in the previous consultation last year, to maintain alignment between climate-related content in the SASB standards and the ISSB's industry-based guidance on implementing IFRS S2, the well-known Appendix B. So we really need your feedback, but we also recognize many of you have just shared your thoughts on SASB standards recently. So for those who commented on our earlier consultation, I want to reiterate that there is no need to repeat feedback you've already given us if it is on the same aspect. We would very much welcome feedback by 24th of July, and this consultation is not the only thing that we've been working on too, and what else has been keeping us busy recently.
Yeah, so we've also published new educational materials, so a new resource to help companies understand some of the requirements in our climate standard, IFRS S2. Specifically, some new materials about the requirement to disclose information to enable investors to understand the resilience of a company's strategy and business model to climate-related changes. And in particular, what this new resource focuses on is insights on an entity's disclosure of how and when scenario analysis was used to inform its assessment of climate resilience. So I really encourage you to check that out on our website, along with a whole suite of other materials on other topics such as materiality, how to use industry-based disclosures, and much more. The other thing we have been doing is working with our advisory bodies, and we had 2 important advisory body meetings this month, in fact this week. So earlier this week we met with the Sustainability Standards Advisory Forum, or SAF. As listeners may have seen, the trustees of the foundation recently announced the new composition of the SAF for the 2026 to 2028 term. So we're pleased to have some new members, some new people from organisations that were already on the SAF, and some old friends that are continuing on the SAF as well. And just to briefly recap, the SAF is the technical advisory body to the ISSB and provides advice to help us when we're developing high-quality standards. So I think we had a really good session, including an informative discussion on our nature-related work, understanding how jurisdictions are thinking about this topic, which is really useful input for our thinking on the form of the standard setting that we'll take on the nature topic. The other group that met this week was our Transition Implementation Group, or TIG for short, which is a group that provides input on implementation questions as companies apply IFRS S1 and IFRS S2. We had a really interesting discussion with the TIG on a question about IFRS S2 and disclosures about biogenic emissions. So firstly, confirming that IFRS S2 requires biogenic emissions to be measured, and then talking about how that information should be presented. So I really recommend people to look at the staff paper, listen to the discussion, and the summary will come out shortly. So that brings us to our board meeting this week. So Emmanuel, do you want to start us off by talking about what we discussed and what we decided on in relation to our project on nature-related disclosures?
Sure. Thank you, Sue. Yeah, so it was a cold, crisp, sunny week here in Montreal. And speaking of nature, absolutely. And we are actually making good progress on our nature-related disclosures project. Our discussion this week came in three parts. The first was nature-related metrics. Second, responding to nature-related risks and opportunities. And third, nature-related targets. We are focused on those topics on providing investors with decision-useful information without creating complexity. So maybe starting with metrics, we first considered industry-based metrics. Nature-related risks and opportunities vary by industry, meaning investors want industry-specific information on nature. We agreed to specify that companies disclosing information on nature refer to and consider the applicability of metrics including in the SASB standards. Those standards provide a strong foundation for meeting investor information needs, as we've known for already a number of years, having the legacy of SASB standards with us now. The second topic is about the sources of guidance. In IFRS S1, we include a number of sources of guidance that companies can use to identify information to disclose. And for example, the GRI standards and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, when that provide information that is investor material. So we agreed this week to propose that companies will be able to use these sources of guidance listed in IFRS S1 in the same way, so when it is investor material, to identify nature-related metrics. We also clarified that a potential option we could consider in a future meeting would be to add to this, for example, referring to the TNFD framework, which is the basis from which we're building on that nature-related work, as we announced already a few months ago. The cross-industry metrics, second, still in metrics. Given metrics available to companies, we agreed to take a targeted approach to cross-industry metrics. We will only consider developing them in relation to topics being specifically considered, such as in relation to location-based information. Then next topic was responding to risks and opportunities. Our next conversation agreed to provide incremental requirements and guidance to entities so that they can provide specific and comparable information. So we will propose that companies disclose this information whether or not that strategy sits within a formal transition plan. Finally, we agreed to provide guidance for disclosing nature-related targets. As a reminder, we don't require companies to set targets. We're obviously policy agnostic, but we do require disclosure of targets where they exist. So companies may set nature-related targets on a range of issues, and we had a good discussion on how that was a large difference with the climate situation. And for example, it could be about land or freshwater and ocean use or pollution reduction. So we will also provide guidance on location-specific information, in addition to the range of targets on which companies might want to set them for themselves. So finally, we also agreed to provide a requirement for companies to disclose whether and how targets are informed by law, regulations, frameworks, or other agreements. 3 detailed papers with good discussions in total and input around the board table reflecting a range of insights, so really good conversations. And therefore, I think that brings us to the other discussion that we had this week with the board. Do you want to talk about the SASB Standards enhancement project?
Sure. So earlier in the podcast, we mentioned that we have just launched a SASB Standards consultation, which is a continuation of the first phase of our process, where we consulted last year on an initial 9 of 12 SASB standards that we had prioritized for enhancements. So at this week's board meeting, we continued digging into the feedback that we received on that consultation last year. And we were really firstly encouraged by the level of engagement on the proposals. So we received more than 200 comment letters from stakeholders from around 50 jurisdictions And that's in addition to having around 200 meetings with nearly 400 organisations. So we feel like we've got a really good spread of feedback from around the world. And what we heard in the feedback was support for the approach that we're taking in a number of key areas. For example, that people supported our approach to enhancing interoperability with other sustainability standards while keeping our focus on meeting investors' information needs. And in particular, they were pleased that we were looking at finding efficiencies with the GRI standards. We also had a really good discussion with the board on how important it is to make sure that we consider proportionality in the SASB standards so that we can be confident that can be used by companies of all different sizes and all different sorts of jurisdictions around the world. So I think we'll hear more about that during the redeliberations. We also noted the important link between the work we're doing to enhance the SASB standards and other work that we're doing. And this came up in the responses as well. So the enhancements that we're doing to the nature-related content in the SASB standards is really important as feedback for our nature-related disclosures project, especially given what Emmanuel just shared on our proposal for those requirements to point to the SASB standards for nature-related metrics. So this enhancement work here is directly relevant to that nature project. In taking the current consultation, two of the industries, agricultural products and meat, poultry and dairy in particular, are going to be important because of the extent of nature-related risks and opportunities in those industries. And when we come to our human capital project, and we expect to be discussing human capital again around the board table in in the next few months, the feedback we got on these SASB enhancements again will be really useful input for that project. So stakeholders, including investors, also supported our proposal in the exposure draft last year to align metrics in the 9 prioritised SASB standards with sort of corresponding metrics in a further 41 SASB standards, where we're trying to make sure there's consistency. So if we ask for a particular water metric, for example, that we use the same one where that's relevant in different industries. And stakeholders thought that was a good idea. Also, they supported the proposal to keep the alignment so that the industry-based guidance in IFRS 2 about climate that we extracted from the SASB standards is updated to continue to have alignment in that climate content between what's in IFRS 2 in the appendix and what's in the SASB standards themselves. And finally, we heard requests for greater clarity about the relationship between the SASB standards and IFRS 1 and IFRS 2. That's a really important point. Again, I think we'll be considering that in future meetings. But in the meantime, in the basis for conclusions in the document we published this week for consultation on the 3 further SASB standards, we made sure to put some more information in about how that relationship works to help to inform that consultation. So hopefully people will find that helpful. Now, before we close, one final area I think it would be good to discuss is what's happening in the European Union, because we expect the European Commission to consult soon on the revised European Sustainability Reporting Standards, ESRS, in the coming weeks. And actually, I joined a panel discussion earlier this week with a bit of a provocative title, Sustainability Reporting, according to CSRD and ISSB, are 2 frameworks, one too many? I'd say no, as long as you're careful. But Emmanuel, you were presenting to the European Parliament recently, so what's the latest here?
Thank you, Sue. And to this question, my point would be there is no reason that there wouldn't be a version of CSRD that would be ISSB inside, basically. And, the EU Omnibus process provided important opportunities to further the alignment between ISSB standards and the ESRS with that shared objective to help companies report as efficiently as possible when they want or need to meet the requirement in both ESRS and ISSB standards. We basically want to avoid companies having to use 2 sets of standards, which would be necessary in the absence of either equivalence or alternative compliance, which basically means, we need to find, and we believe we see a clear pathway to unlocking that objective, that you can do one with the other if you do it properly. So the first point is we want to make sure that entities that are preparing under the ESRS are able to effectively tell their investor story through the way they present information when applying the ISSB standards. This would mean ESRS being less prescriptive than they are in the final advice of EFRAG to the Commission, with the structure of reporting, removing the requirements to report in a specific order of topic as it is now. The second would be that we need to ensure that information for investors is accessible, well identified and not obscured. And this would mean making sure information for other stakeholders is also clearly identified. So around these conversations, our focus remains on working with the European Commission and EFRAG to further align the ISSB standards and ESRS to get to this objective that you could prepare an ISSB report out of an ESRS report. And conversely, coming from outside of the EU, if you've been using the ISSB standards as your base because your home base is one of the 40 jurisdictions that adopt the ISSB standards, you may be interested for your European subsidiary to start from the ISSB standards and add, with less prescriptive presentation requirements in the ESRS, what's necessary to fulfill the full requirements of double materiality of the CSRD. We know this matters a great deal to report preparers through all the conversation that we're having with our preparer groups, engagements in various international instances, because greater alignment can make reporting much more efficient in practice, especially when so many jurisdictions are starting their own ISSB practice here. So, as always, we really appreciate the engagement with companies, investors, regulators, and many others around the world around this topic and many others that we will be discussing in the future and that we're excited about. Talking about being excited, I'll just finish by saying that a recent research by Morningstar shows that ISSB standards disclosures are actually now topping the list of investor demands for sustainability disclosures, with half of respondents to their survey from EMEA. So it is great to see that support from our core audience, basically, and I'd like to thank everyone for their trust in our work. I guess that's it for this pretty busy month, Sue. It was a pleasure to be here in Montreal. I'd like to thank everyone for listening to this ISSB podcast. I'd like to say and repeat that, as you said, to learn more, including about the SASB Standards consultation, educational material and climate resilience, you can visit the IFRS Foundation website. And otherwise, just know that next month we'll be meeting in our Beijing office, and we look forward to speaking then.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please take the time to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast player. Please contact us on communications@ifrs.org with any questions, comments, or suggestions. You can also sign up for email alerts on our website, ifrs.org, or find us on social media.